I was 10 years old the night a pregnant Sasquatch came to our cabin door in labor, and what my mother decided to do about it is the reason I am alive to tell you this story. It was March of 1978 in the Yaak Valley of northwestern Montana, a place so remote that the nearest paved road was 11 miles away and the nearest doctor was 40 more past that. My mother was not a doctor. She was a former maternity nurse from Kalispell who had married a logger and moved into country so wild that deer walked past our porch like house cats. And on that particular night, her nursing training was the only thing standing between life and death for a mother who was not human at all. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Connie Praether. I grew up on 160 acres of homestead ground at the end of a Forest Service spur road 7 miles up the Yaak River from the little community store that was the only business for miles in any direction. My father, Frank Praether, worked seasonal timber jobs for the Stoltz Land and Lumber Company out of Columbia Falls, cutting on contracts that took him into the Kootenai National Forest for weeks at a stretch. My mother, Loretta, had trained as a maternity nurse at a hospital in Kalispell before she married my father and traded her uniform for a homestead kitchen and a wood stove. I had one brother, Dale, 3 years older than me, who could shoot a rifle better than most grown men in the valley by the time he was 12. My father had grown up on a dairy operation outside Kalispell himself, one of 6 boys, and had left home at 17 to work a Forest Service trail crew for 2 summers before drifting into timber work full time, first as a choker setter, then a chaser, and finally, by the time I was born, a faller, trusted to drop the biggest trees on any crew he worked. He was not a large man, wiry rather than broad, but he had a stillness in the field that other loggers respected, a habit of reading a tree's lean in the direction of its heaviest limbs before he ever touched a saw to bark, which was the same stillness he brought to reading terrain, weather, and eventually the ground where a mother and father Sasquatch had chosen to raise their child. He rarely spoke more than he had to, a trait my mother used to say she'd married for rather than in spite of, because a household with one talker and one listener runs a good deal smoother than one with two of either. The Yaak had a reputation in that part of Montana long before 1978, though it was the kind of reputation people mentioned mostly in passing, a joke traded between loggers or a half-serious warning given to hunters heading in from out of state. Old-timers in Troy and Yaak proper talked about strange calls in the timber going back to at least the 1930s, and a handful of trappers before my grandfather's time were said to have quietly abandoned productive lines rather than keep working ground that unsettled them for reasons they could never quite name. None of it was written down in any official record that I ever found. It lived much as most real history in a place like the Yak Lives, in kitchen conversations and barstool stories, passed along casually enough that most people who heard it filed it away as color rather than fact, the same instinct that would later let my parents hide an impossible truth behind a series of perfectly ordinary explanations. 1978 was Jimmy Carter's second year in the White House, and even in a place as far removed from the rest of the country as the Yak, we felt the edges of what was happening beyond our valley. Gas ran short enough that my father sometimes drove to Troy on a Tuesday specifically because the station there rationed by license plate number, and the battery-powered radio my mother kept on the kitchen shelf pulled in a station out of Kalispell that played more Bee Gees than any of us cared for, though Dale would turn it up anyway whenever it came through clear. We were not cut off from the world entirely. We were simply far enough from the center of it that the things happening in that timber behind our cabin mattered more to our daily lives than anything happening in Washington ever could. The Yaak sits tucked into the far northwestern corner of Montana, pinched between the Purcell Mountains and the Whitefish Range, close enough to Idaho and British Columbia that the weather comes in wet and stays that way most of the year. It is cedar and hemlock country, thick and dark, with more moisture than the rest of dry eastern Montana ever sees, and in 1978 it was about as isolated as any inhabited place in the lower 48 states. We had a party line telephone that worked maybe half the time. We had a generator for the radio and not much else. Everything passed that ran on kerosene, wood smoke, and whatever my mother could grow or preserve or trade for at the store in town. I want to tell you about the winter before I tell you about that night, because the winter is where the strangeness started in small pieces that none of us wanted to look at directly. It began with the meat house. My father kept a smokehouse about 40 yards behind the cabin, a low log building where we cured elk and deer through the cold months. In late January, he found the door standing open one morning, the leather hinge strap torn clean through, and two full hindquarters gone from the rafters. He blamed a bear at first, though. Every man in the valley knew black bears den up solid by January and don't come out hungry until April. There were no claw marks on the doorframe. There were no tooth marks left on the wood where the hinge had been fastened. Whatever had opened that door had used something closer to hands than claws, and it had carried away over 80 pounds of meat without dragging so much as a blood trail across the snow.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
My father spent most of that morning circling the smokehouse looking for any explanation that fit inside the world as he understood it. He checked the roofline for signs a raccoon or marten had gotten in through a gap in the shakes. He checked the ground for the kind of drag marks a bear or a wolverine leaves when it hauls off more than it can carry in its jaws. He found nothing that matched any animal he had spent a lifetime reading sign for. And he told my mother that evening in the flat, unbothered voice he used whenever something genuinely troubled him that somebody local was likely playing a joke, stealing meat and rigging the door to look strange for the sake of a story to tell at the tavern in Troy. My mother did not argue with him about it, but she started keeping the rifle loaded and leaned by the door from that night forward, which was not a thing she had ever felt the need to do in 10 years on that homestead. My father set a trap line after that, more out of frustration than real expectation, and 2 nights later something sprung the traps without getting caught in a single one of them. He found each trap disarmed and moved 8 or 9 feet from where he'd set it, the seer tripped clean, sitting harmless in the open like a taunt. Then came the tracks. My brother Dale found the first set in a fresh 2 inches of snow along the game trail that ran behind our woodlot in the second week of February. He came running back to the cabin white in the face and made my father come look before the snow could melt or drift over it. I remember standing next to my father while he crouched over one print, running his bare fingers along the edge of it. It was close to 16 inches long, wider through the ball of the foot than any boot in our house, with 5 toes pressed into the crust of the snow so clearly that you could see the ridges of skin. The stride between one print and the next was close to 5 feet. My father did not say much. He filled the print in with more snow, as he always did when he didn't want my mother worrying, and told Dale and me not to mention it to her. We told her anyway, of course, as kids do, and my mother did not seem half as rattled as my father expected. She only asked how deep the print sank into the snow, and when Dale told her, she nodded slowly and went back to her mending, like she had already worked something out in her head that she wasn't ready to say. I found out later that my mother had grown up in Troy, another Lincoln County town not far from us, and that her own father had spent 40 years running trap lines through the Purcells, and had told her more than once that there were things up in that timber that a smart trapper left alone and never spoke of at the dinner table. She had grown up believing it the way most people believe any story their father tells you enough times, half true and half legend, until the winter it stopped being a story and started leaving footprints behind our woodlot. My grandfather, a man named Otto Farron, whom I never met because he died 2 years before I was born, had apparently seen something himself in the winter of 1941 up near the head of Bear Creek that he would only ever describe to my mother in the vaguest terms, a shape crossing a clearing at dusk on 2 legs, too tall and too broad through the shoulders to be any man out checking his own lines. He never reported it to anyone outside the family. My mother said he told her once that a trapper's whole living depended on people trusting his judgment about what was and was not dangerous in these mountains, and that a story about an 8-foot shape in the trees was the fastest way to lose every ounce of that trust, whether folks believed you or simply decided you spent too many winters alone. So he kept it to himself the same way most men in that country kept anything to themselves that did not fit neatly into the world, as everyone else agreed it worked, and he passed the habit of that silence down to my mother, along with the story itself. She told me years afterward that she thought about her own father constantly. During those 6 days, the family stayed with us, wondering what he would have made of his daughter kneeling on her own cabin floor with her bare hands inside the birth of the very thing he had spent his whole life warning her to leave alone. She decided somewhere in the middle of that long first night that he would have understood completely. Leaving something alone, she said, had never meant turning your back on it when it was suffering. It had only ever meant not going looking for trouble that was not yours to go looking for. The trouble had come to her door on its own that night, and once it had, her father's whole life of careful silence would have told her exactly what to do about it. Late in February, my father drove all three of us into Troy for supplies, a rare enough trip that Dale and I spent most of the ride arguing over who would get to pick out penny candy at the Mercantile once we arrived. Troy sat on the Kootenai River, a real town by our standards, with a hardware store, a grade school, and a single tavern where the men who worked timber gathered most evenings to trade news that traveled faster by word of mouth than any newspaper could manage. While my father loaded feed and kerosene into the truck bed, my mother took Dale and me into the Mercantile, and I remember overhearing two women at the counter trading gossip about a rancher out past Bull Lake who swore something had been screaming in his hay meadow most nights that week, loud enough to set his dogs howling from inside a locked barn. My mother did not say a word through any of it, but she bought a full case of matches that day instead of the usual box, and on the drive home she was quieter than I had ever known her to be. It was on that same drive that I first heard the story of how my parents had met, though I did not understand until years later why my mother chose to tell it that particular afternoon. She had been 23 years old, working the maternity ward at the hospital in Kalispell when a logger came through the emergency entrance one November night carrying a woman in labor who had gone into hard contractions 3 weeks early on a homestead nearly 30 miles out of town with no way to reach a doctor faster than driving her in himself over roads already glazed with the first hard freeze of the season. My mother had been the nurse on duty that delivered the baby, a boy who came 2 months underweight but breathing steady, and the logger who had driven that frightened young mother in through the ice and dark had been my father's own crew boss at the time, a man who told the story so often around the bunkhouse that my father had heard every detail of it before he ever laid eyes on the nurse at its center. When he finally did meet her at a Grange dance the following spring, he told her he already knew she was the kind of woman who did not panic when everything around her was falling apart, and my mother told him that was, in fact, the single finest compliment any man had ever paid her. I understood hearing that story again as an adult and turning it over against everything that happened in March of 1978, that my mother had spent her entire adult life being the person other people reached for in the worst hour of their lives, long before a laboring Sasquatch ever came within a mile of our cabin. The steadiness she showed that night at our door had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been built, delivery by delivery, through years of trusting her own two hands over her own fear, and by the time fear finally asked something of her that no nursing textbook had ever prepared her for, she already knew in her bones exactly how to answer it. The sounds started in early March, not every night, but often enough that we all learned to listen for them. A low call drawn out over several seconds, pitched lower than any elk bugle or coyote howl I had ever heard coming from somewhere up the ridge behind the cabin after full dark. Sometimes it was answered from a second direction further off, and the two sounds would go back and forth for a few minutes before falling silent. My father called it whine moving through a hollow snag. My mother never argued with him about it out loud, but I noticed she started leaving the woodpile better stocked before dark, and she started keeping the shutters on the north-facing window latched even in mild weather. On the 9th of March, the temperature broke into the 40s for 2 straight days, the kind of early thaw that happens in the yak just often enough to trick you into thinking spring has arrived a month ahead of schedule. My father had gone out on a hauling contract 18 miles north near the Yak River Bridge crossing and was not due back until the following evening. It was just my mother, Dale, and me in the cabin that night with a low fire going and a pot of venison stew on the stove when the weather turned again the way it does in that country, dropping 30 degrees in under 3 hours as a front came down off the Purcells and brought freezing rain behind it. It was somewhere close to 11 at night when we heard the sound at the door. Not a knock, nothing so orderly as a knock. It was a low, heavy moan so deep it seemed to come up through the floorboards before it reached my ears, followed by the plain, crushing weight of something enormous pressing against the outside wall of our cabin. My mother was up out of her chair before either Dale or I could react. She told us both to stay back, and she took the lamp from the table and crossed to the window instead of the door, easing the shutter open just far enough to look out into the sleet and the dark. I will tell you exactly what she told me she saw, because she described it to me so many times over the following years that I could recite it before I understood what it meant. There was a shape against the woodpile hunched forward, both arms wrapped around its own middle, swaying as a person sways when trying to breathe through pain. It was covered in hair the color of wet slate, dark and heavy with the freezing rain, and even bent double as it was, it stood taller than the top of our doorframe. And it was alone. No answering call came from the ridge. No second shape moved at the tree line. Whatever had brought it down out of the timber and up against our cabin wall in the middle of a freezing rainstorm, it had come by itself. My mother set the lamp down on the sill. She told us both in a voice I had never heard her use before, flat and certain in a way that left no room for argument, that something was in trouble out there and that she needed us to help her get the door bar up. Dale asked her if she was out of her mind. I remember that exactly because it was the only time in my life I ever heard my brother question our mother to her face. She did not answer him. She simply lifted the heavy oak bar off its brackets herself, set it against the wall, and told us both again to stand back. When she opened that door, the smell hit us first, a thick, musky animal warmth that cut straight through the cold rain pouring in around the frame. And then the shape at the woodpile turned toward the light, and I saw for the first time in my life a face that was not human and not any animal I could name, broad through the jaw, with a heavy ridge of bone above deep-set eyes that caught the lamplight and threw it back at us in a dull amber shine. Its breath came out in ragged clouds. Its enormous hands were pressed low against its own belly, and beneath that thick, sodden hair I could see the clear swell of a body far along in pregnancy. My mother did not scream. She did not step back. She stood in that open doorway with the freezing rain soaking straight through her nightclothes, looked at the laboring female standing not 10 feet from her own children, and said in the same voice she used to gentle a spooked horse, all right now, come on in, out of it." I do not think to this day that the female understood the words, but she understood the tone, and she understood the open door, and after a long, shuddering moment during which none of us in that cabin breathed, she came forward, stooping low to clear the doorframe, and stepped into our home. I need to explain to you what our cabin looked like that night because the space itself became part of what happened. It was one main room, maybe 20 feet by 28, with a stone hearth on the west wall, a plank table in the center, and a curtained-off sleeping area for my parents along the back. Dale and I slept in a loft above, reached by a ladder nailed to the wall. My mother's nursing bag, the same canvas satchel she had carried through 3 years of maternity work in Kalispell before she married my father, hung on a peg by the door out of habit more than use, because in 10 years on that homestead, she had never once needed it for anything more than stitching up a logging cut or setting Dale's broken finger. She needed it that night. The female Sasquatch, once she was fully inside, seemed almost too large for the room, her shoulders nearly brushing the roof beams when she straightened, though she kept herself hunched and small, trying not to seem threatening in a strange place. My mother guided her, more with gesture and tone than with any touch, toward the open floor space in front of the hearth, and had Dale drag over every quilt and hide we owned to lay down a bed on the plank floor. The female lowered herself onto it with obvious effort, one massive hand braced against the floorboards, the other still pressed to her middle, and let out a long, low moan that I felt in my own chest more than I heard with my ears. My mother knelt beside her. I remember watching her hands steady in a way that nothing in that moment should have allowed them to be, moving with the same brisk competence I'd seen her use once when a neighbor woman went into early labor on our kitchen table 2 winters before. She told Dale to get more wood on the fire and to fill every pot we owned with water to heat. She told me to hold the lamp steady and stay clear otherwise. And then she did something that I have thought about every day since. She reached out and laid her bare palm flat against the female's swollen belly, the way she would have done for any laboring mother in Kalispell, checking the position, feeling for the rhythm of contractions, and the female did not flinch away from her. She turned her head and looked at my mother with those deep amber eyes, and something passed between the two of them in that look that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with the oldest understanding there is between one mother and another. The contractions were coming close together already, less than 3 minutes apart by my mother's counting, which told her the labor was well advanced by the time the female had reached our door. My mother worked as she had been trained to work, checking presentation, checking the strength and spacing of each contraction, keeping her voice low, and even the entire time, even when the female's own sounds grew louder and more desperate. Twice my mother had to physically guide one of those enormous hands away from where it had begun clawing at the plank floor in pain, redirecting the grip instead to a rolled quilt that could take the strain without splintering. Somewhere past the first hour, my mother's face changed in a way I had never seen before, a narrowing of concentration that made her look for a moment like a woman doing arithmetic under pressure. She had me hold the lamp closer while she felt along the female's abdomen with both hands, pressing and reading the shape beneath the skin, the same patient, deliberate manner I had once watched her use on a heifer my father thought was carrying twins. She told me afterward that for a few frightening minutes she had believed the baby was presenting wrong, feet or hip first instead of crown first, which in a human delivery would have meant an immediate transfer to a hospital 40 miles away that did not exist for this patient no matter how badly it was needed. She worked her palms along the swell of the belly with a calm I did not understand, as forced until years later, applying gentle testing pressure at specific points, much as she had learned in her training for turning a breech baby from outside the body before labor progressed too far to attempt it. Whatever she found, it resolved itself within a few contractions, either because the baby shifted on its own, as babies sometimes do at the last possible moment, or because my mother's hands had done exactly what they were meant to do. She never said for certain which it had been, and I never asked her to guess out loud, because some things, once safely passed, are better left as mysteries than picked apart for the sake of a story that already ended well. The smell filled every corner of that small room within minutes, thick and warm and animal, in a way that was not unpleasant so much as overwhelming musk and wet hair and something underneath it that reminded me oddly of the inside of our root cellar in late autumn, earthy and mineral and alive. The heat coming off her body was its own kind of presence in that cabin. I remember sweating in my nightgown despite standing well back from the fire. The whole room turned close and humid, the kind of heat you'd expect in high summer, though outside the sleet kept hammering against the shutters and the temperature had not climbed above freezing all night. Her sounds changed as the labor progressed, moving from low moans into something with more structure to it, rising and falling in patterns that did not sound random even to a 10-year-old standing frightened in the corner. I did not understand yet that I was hearing language, or something close enough to language that the distinction barely mattered, but I understood that the sounds meant something because my mother kept responding to them, adjusting her hands, murmuring back in a low, steady voice that seemed to calm the rhythm each time. An hour passed, maybe more. The fire roared. The water in every pot we owned went from cold to steaming, and outside the freezing rain kept coming down against the shutters in long, gusting sheets. I stood pressed into the corner by the ladder with the lamp in my hands, watching my own mother, a woman who canned tomatoes and mended socks and scolded my father for tracking mud across her floor, calmly coach the birth of a creature the rest of the world would have called a myth. It was somewhere past midnight when the labor reached its hardest point. The female's cries had dropped from moaning into something closer to the deep, rolling calls we had been hearing from the ridge all month. Low and rolling, and I understood then with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside, that those nighttime sounds we had all been pretending were wind had never been wind at all. My mother told her to push. She did not say the word in English and expect it understood. She used pressure on the female's hand, a rhythm of squeezes timed to the contractions, the same wordless coaching she must have used with laboring mothers who spoke no English back in her hospital days, and the female exhausted and shaking, followed the rhythm my mother gave her. The baby came at 20 minutes past 1 in the morning. I will not pretend I understood everything I was seeing in that moment, crouched in the corner with a lamp shaking in my 10-year-old hands, but I understood enough. My mother caught the infant in a clean flour sack towel, cleared its airway with two quick, practiced motions, and in the space of a breath that felt like it lasted a full minute, the baby let out a sound, not a cry. A short, low pulse of vocalization that rolled through our small cabin and seemed to answer something in the mother, because the female's whole enormous body went slack with relief, and she reached for the bundle in my mother's hands with an urgency that needed no translation at all. My mother laid the infant against the mother's chest. It was already covered in a fine dark hair, its hands disproportionately large even for a newborn, its grip closing around my mother's offered finger with a strength that made her laugh out loud, a short startled sound that broke the tension in the room like a window opening. The afterbirth came a short while later, and my mother handled it with the same clinical care she would have given any human delivery, wrapping it in cloth to be dealt with outside away from the cabin, because even in the strangest night of her life, some instincts about hygiene and practicality did not leave her. By 2 in the morning, the female Sasquatch lay on our cabin floor with her newborn nursing against her chest, both of them breathing slow and even, and the storm outside had begun to ease into a steady, gentler rain. My mother sat back on her heels, her hands and forearms streaked with blood that was not so different in color from any blood she'd seen before, and looked across the room at Dale and me like she was seeing us for the first time in hours. She told us to go up to the loft and try to sleep. Neither of us managed much of it. I lay on my straw mattress, listening to the sounds below, the occasional low murmur from the mother, the soft crackle of the fire, my own mother's careful footsteps as she checked on her patient through what remained of the night, and I understood even as a child that something had shifted permanently in the shape of my family's life. My father came home the next evening, a full day later than expected, because the thaw had turned the logging road into an axle-deep bog that took his crew half a day to work a truck out of. He walked into our cabin expecting supper, and found instead his wife exhausted at the table, his children wide-eyed and silent, and an 8-foot-tall female Sasquatch nursing a newborn on a bed of quilts in front of his own hearth. I have heard my father tell his side of that moment only a handful of times in his life, because he was not a man who enjoyed admitting he had ever been frightened of anything, but he told it the same way every time. He said he stood in that doorway for a long count of 10 without moving a muscle, his hand still on the latch, and that in all his years working timber in some of the roughest country in Montana, he had never once felt smaller than he did standing in his own front room, looking at that mother and infant by his own fire. He said my mother looked up at him from where she sat and said only, "She needed help, Frank. That's all there is to it." And that something about the plainness of how she said it made the whole impossible scene feel, for a moment, almost ordinary. He did not argue with her. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy for him to demand the female be put back out into the weather the moment he found his strength again, and he never did. He set down his gear, hung his wet coat by the door the same as any other night, and asked my mother, in a voice still not quite steady, whether the mother or the baby needed anything more than what she'd already given them. That was the kind of man my father was underneath the gruffness, and it was the reason my mother had married him in the first place. I have to tell you about the second night because it is the one I remember most clearly even now, decades later. The birth itself had happened so fast and so frightening that most of it comes back to me in pieces. But the second night was quieter, and quiet things stay with a child longer than chaos does. My mother had set up a rotation for checking on her patient through the night, the same way she must have done for new mothers back in her hospital days, and somewhere close to 3 in the morning she woke me gently and asked if I wanted to come down and see the baby while the mother slept. I climbed down the ladder in my stocking feet, half convinced I was still dreaming, and found my mother kneeling by the hearth with the infant cradled against her own chest, while the exhausted mother slept deeply just beside her, worn out from a labor that would have hospitalized any human woman for a week. The baby's eyes were open, dark and steady, and when my mother shifted her slightly toward me, those eyes tracked the movement and settled on my face with an attention that felt entirely too aware for something not yet 2 days old. I remember reaching out one finger as you do with any newborn and having it wrapped instantly in a grip strong enough that I gasped out loud, which made my mother laugh under her breath and tell me to hush before I woke the whole cabin. She told me something that night that I did not understand until I was much older. She said that fear, real fear, the kind that keeps you from ever trying to understand a thing, almost always comes from being asked to decide too fast. She said the reason she had been able to open that door without hesitating was that some part of her had been deciding for years, quietly, without knowing it, every time her own father told her those old stories about the Purcells, every time she chose to believe there was more to this country than what showed up on a map. By the time the decision actually came, she said it had already been made a long time before, and all that was left to do was act on it. The female stayed with us for 6 days. My mother would not let her leave any sooner, and to my lasting amazement, the mother seemed to understand that the small, quick-moving woman kneeling over her every few hours was the reason both she and her baby were still breathing, because she never once showed any sign of wanting to fight past her or force the door. She lay by our hearth through that first full day, sleeping in long stretches, waking to nurse, watching my mother move around the cabin with an attentiveness that felt less like an animal tracking a threat and more like a woman learning the layout of a house she intended to trust. My father kept his rifle within reach that whole week, propped by the door where it always stood, but he never once raised it. He told me years later that the thing that convinced him fastest was not the birth itself, but the second morning when he went out before light to split kindling and found the smokehouse door standing open again, just as it had back in January, except this time there was a fresh haunch of venison hanging inside that had not been there the evening before, still steaming faintly in the cold. Nothing of ours had been taken. Something had been left. He stood there with his splitting maul in his hand and understood the same way my mother had understood 2 nights earlier that whatever logic governed the world beyond our tree line, it was not the logic of predator and prey. The baby, a female, grew visibly larger even in those first 6 days, which unsettled my mother more than almost anything else she witnessed. She had delivered enough human infants to know what 6 days of normal growth looked like, and this was not that. By the fourth day, the baby's grip had strengthened enough that my mother stopped, letting Dale hold her fingers out for the infant to grab, worried the small bones in his hand might not hold up to it. The baby's eyes, dark and alert from the moment she was born, tracked movement around the cabin with an awareness that no human newborn possesses, following my mother's hands as she worked, following Dale and me as we moved past the hearth, following the shifting light of the fire itself with an interest that felt almost studious. By the second full day, my father had settled enough into the strangeness of it that he began doing small, practical things for the mother without being asked, the same way he would have looked after any exhausted new mother recovering under his roof. He kept the wood stove fed through the night without my mother having to remind him. He hauled extra water up from the spring twice a day, so there was always a full kettle heating, and on the third morning, without a word to anyone, he walked out before light and came back an hour later with a fresh-killed grouse, which he cleaned and roasted whole over the coals and set down within the mother's reach, rather than handing it to her directly, the same careful distance he might have given a nervous mare recovering from a hard foaling. Dale, for his part, spent most of those 6 days keeping his distance, watching from the loft ladder or the far side of the room with the wary fascination of a boy who wanted very badly to understand what he was looking at but had not yet decided it was safe to get closer. It was the 5th day before he came down on his own and offered to help my mother change the bedding beneath the mother, dragging over a fresh set of quilts while my mother eased the exhausted patient onto her side long enough to swap the soiled hides for clean ones. My mother told me she watched Dale's hands shake through the whole task, not from fear exactly, but from the particular kind of nervous concentration a boy gets when he has decided all at once that a stranger's comfort matters more than his own being scared of it. I remember the 4th day most of all because it was the day I finally stopped being afraid enough to sit close. My mother had been giving the mother a broth she'd made from marrow bones simmered down thick, feeding it to her a spoonful at a time from a tin cup because the mother's own enormous hands, capable of splitting a green log without an axe, seemed almost too large and too clumsy for the delicate business of holding a small cup steady. I asked my mother if I could try, and she looked at me for a long moment, weighing the request with real seriousness before she handed me the cup and told me to go slow and keep my voice low. I knelt beside that hearth with a tin cup of bone broth and fed a nursing mother twice my own height, a spoonful at a time, and she watched me the entire time with those deep, amber eyes, patient and unblinking, in a manner that made me feel, for the first time since that whole ordeal began, less like a frightened child and more like someone who had a job to do and was doing it properly. When the cup was empty, she reached out with one finger, careful as a person handling a bird's egg, and touched the back of my hand just once before letting it rest again on the quilt beside her. My mother told me afterward that in 20 years of nursing she had never seen a patient offer that particular kind of thanks, and that she suspected it meant more coming from that mother than any spoken word ever could have. On the third night, the low calls returned to the ridge behind our cabin, closer than they had ever come before, and my mother told my father plainly that the calls were the father looking for his family and that keeping them separated any longer than necessary was not a delay she intended to permit. My father argued with her about it for the first and only time that week. He did not want a full-grown male Sasquatch, easily twice his own weight, standing at the edge of their clearing after dark with two of his children asleep in a loft 12 feet off the ground. My mother told him that the female had trusted us with the most vulnerable moment of her life, and that trust, once given, deserved to be honored rather than second-guessed out of fear. My father, who had never in his life won an argument against my mother when her mind was set, gave in. We saw him for the first time on the fourth evening, right at dusk, standing at the tree line where the woodlot gave way to timber. He was immense in a way that the female, for all her own size, had not quite prepared me for, easily 8.5 feet standing upright with shoulders so broad they seemed to distort the shape of the trees behind him. His hair was darker than hers, nearly black, thick and matted with the last of the melting snow, and even from that distance I could see the deliberate way he held himself still. Watching the cabin, watching the smoke curling up from our chimney, waiting, my mother did the thing that still amazes me most when I think back on that week. She walked out onto the porch alone, without the rifle, without even a lamp, and stood in plain sight of him for a long, silent minute. Then she went back inside, came out a moment later carrying the swaddled infant, and held her up just slightly, angled so the light from the open cabin door fell across the baby's face. The sound the male made in response is not something I can describe to you in a way that does it justice. It was low, and it rolled across the clearing like something felt in the ground before it was heard in the air, not aggressive, not loud the way a shout is loud, but full like a held breath finally released. The female, still recovering by our fire, answered him from inside the cabin, and for several minutes the two of them called back and forth across that short distance, my mother standing between them with the infant in her arms, like some kind of unlikely, unqualified messenger between two families who had no language in common except the one that mattered most. He did not come closer that night. He did not come inside the clearing at all until the female was strong enough to walk on her own, which happened on the morning of the 6th day. I remember watching her rise from the nest of quilts by our hearth, testing her own weight as anyone recovering from a hard birth would, and I remember the quiet, businesslike way my mother helped her to her feet, checking her over one last time, as she would have checked any patient before discharge, pressing gently at her abdomen, watching her color, watching the way she carried the baby against her chest. When the female finally stepped out through our cabin door into the pale morning light, the male was already waiting at the edge of the clearing, and this time he came forward to meet her. My whole family stood in the doorway and watched the two of them come together, watched him reach out with one massive hand and rest it with a gentleness that seemed impossible, given his size against the side of the infant's small, dark head. Then the female turned back toward us just for a moment and looked directly at my mother. I do not know how to explain what passed in that look, except to say that I have never, before or since, seen gratitude expressed so plainly by any living thing, human or otherwise. The morning itself was still and cold, the last frost of that spring silvering the grass in the clearing, and the light coming low through the cedar canopy cast the whole scene in a pale, watery gold. I remember the particular quiet of it most of all. No birdsong yet at that hour, no wind moving through the timber, only the soft, deliberate sound of four sets of feet crossing frozen ground, too enormous, too impossibly small, moving unhurried toward the tree line as if the last 6 days inside our cabin had been nothing more than a brief, necessary pause in a much longer journey already well underway. They walked into the timber together and they were gone. For the rest of that spring, we found evidence that they had not gone far. Tracks along the game trail behind the woodlot, spaced in a pattern that told my father a family group was moving together rather than a solitary animal ranging alone. A fresh killed grouse left on the chopping block one morning in April, its neck cleanly broken, set there with the same deliberate care as that first haunch of venison. My mother never spoke of these things as strange after that first week. She spoke of them the way you speak of a neighbor who checks in on you now and then with a kind of settled, unremarkable acceptance that took Dale and me most of that summer to catch up to. Not everyone in the valley left us as much peace about it as the family themselves did. In early May, a trapper named Otis Pruitt, who ran a line up along Spread Creek and stopped by our place every few weeks to trade or gossip, mentioned to my father that he'd come across a set of tracks along the upper Yaak that he could not account for. 16 inches, if they were an inch, pressed deep into soft ground near a beaver pond he'd been checking. He laughed about it the way men in that country laughed about things they did not want to admit, unsettled them, called it a big grizzly walking upright through soft mud, and asked my father if he'd seen anything similar closer to our place. My father told him no, in the same flat, unbothered voice he used for talking about weather or feed prices. And Otis let the subject drop the way most men in the Yak let most subjects drop. Once a plausible explanation had been offered and nobody pressed too hard against it. But my mother told me afterward that she'd watched my father's hands while he answered, and that they had not shaken, not even slightly. And she said that was the moment she understood her husband had decided fully and permanently to become as careful a keeper of this secret as she already was. It was not the last time someone came close. In June, a fish and game warden named Elmer Castile drove the spur road up to our place after a rancher 3 miles downriver reported a calf missing under circumstances nobody could explain. No blood trail, no carcass, no sign of predation consistent with a cougar or bear kill. Elmer sat at our kitchen table and asked my parents whether they'd noticed anything unusual on our own ground that spring. My father told him about the smokehouse door back in January, which was true and already half known around the valley by then anyway, and let Elmer draw his own conclusions about a hungry bear coming out of a long winter early. Elmer wrote it up that way in his report, and the missing calf became one more unsolved oddity in a country that had absorbed plenty of those over the years without anyone losing much sleep over it. My mother told me many years later that those two visits, Otis Pruitt's tracks and Elmer Castile's missing calf, taught her more about how to protect the family than anything else that whole spring. She said the trick was never to lie outright, because a lie invites more questions than it answers. The trick was to offer the ordinary explanation first, plainly and without hesitation, and to let people's own reluctance to believe anything stranger do the rest of the work for you. Most folks in the Yak, she said, wanted an ordinary answer more than they wanted the true one, and all she and my father ever had to do was hand them the ordinary answer before they had time to go looking for anything else. The hardest test of that whole approach came in the middle of August, and it did not come from anyone local at all. 1977 had been the year a television program out of Los Angeles, hosted by an actor most of us knew from a science fiction show, ran an episode devoted entirely to Bigfoot, weaving together the Patterson film out of Northern California with interviews from loggers and hunters across the Pacific Northwest who claimed encounters of their own. That episode had aired in reruns through the winter and spring, and by the summer of 1978, half the truck stops between Kalispell and Spokane had a paperback about the subject sitting on a wire rack by the register, and a fair number of curious young men with cameras and camping gear had started showing up in small logging towns across Montana and Idaho, hoping to succeed where the professionals hadn't. One of them came to the yacht in the second week of August. His name was Gary Pelletier, and he arrived driving a Volkswagen bus with Washington plates, loaded down with a reel-to-reel tape recorder, two cameras, and a stack of plaster of Paris for casting tracks, and he set up in the community store parking lot most afternoons that week, buying coffee for anyone willing to sit and talk about anything strange they might have noticed in the timber that year. He was not a con man as far as I could ever tell. He genuinely believed in what he was chasing, and he had read enough about the subject to ask smarter, more specific questions than most of the men in town were prepared for. Questions about wood knocking, about the particular pitch of a call versus an elk bugle, about whether anyone had noticed food or livestock disappearing without the usual signs of predation. My father heard about him from Otis Pruitt before he ever laid eyes on the man himself, and he came home that evening and told my mother in the same flat voice he used for anything that genuinely worried him that there was a fellow in town asking exactly the kind of questions that could lead somebody straight up our spur road if he asked them of the wrong person long enough. My mother did not panic. She asked my father calmly whether anyone in town knew about the smokehouse, the tracks, or the calls on the ridge, and my father admitted that most of the valley knew at least pieces of it by then, much as any small community eventually knows most of what happens inside its own borders, gossip traveling farther and faster than either of my parents had ever fully accounted for. Gary Pelletier drove up our spur road himself on the fourth day of his stay, having apparently heard from someone in town that the Praether place backed up against wild country with a reputation for strange happenings. My mother met him on the porch before he'd even gotten both feet out of the bus, polite and unhurried, and invited him in for coffee, the same as she would have invited any stranger passing through, because she had decided, in the handful of seconds it took him to walk up from his vehicle, that refusing to speak with him at all would only make him more curious, not less. I sat at our kitchen table that afternoon and watched my mother handle Gary Pelletier with a skill that I did not fully appreciate until I was much older and had spent my own years learning how difficult it actually is to tell the truth about small, verifiable things while withholding the one enormous truth that mattered most. She told him about the smokehouse door, exactly as it had happened, and let him write down every detail in his notebook. She told him about the tracks Dale had found in February, the measurements, the stride length, all of it accurate down to the inch, because there was no reason to lie about facts that could be independently confirmed by half a dozen other people in the valley. She told him about the calls on the ridge and even admitted, when he asked directly, that she and my father had both heard them more than once through the winter and early spring. What she did not tell him, and what neither Dale nor I said one word about, despite Gary asking us both directly whether we'd seen anything ourselves, was a single detail about the 6 days that had passed inside our own front room in March. My mother steered the conversation, gently and without any obvious effort, toward the kind of answer Gary Pelletier had already heard a dozen times that week in a dozen other kitchens across the valley, an account consistent with tracks, sounds, and a missing haunch of meat and nothing more. He left our place 2 hours later with a full notebook and a plaster cast he'd made of one of the old February tracks, still visible in a shaded hollow near the woodlot where the snow had lingered into a soft mud that held an impression well enough to cast. He came back once more 3 days later, this time asking specifically whether any of us had ever seen the animal itself, using that exact word, and my mother told him, with a steadiness that still amazes me when I remember it, that no, she had not, and that whatever had been coming around our place through the winter had kept itself well out of sight the entire time. It was, strictly speaking, the only outright lie she told anyone that whole summer, and she told me once, years later, that it was also the only lie of her life she had never once regretted, because the alternative was unthinkable to her in a way that made the choice easy rather than difficult. Gary Pelletier left the yacht at the end of that week, having gathered enough plaster casts and secondhand testimony from around the valley to fill out a chapter in a self-published book he put out 2 years later, a slim paperback my mother actually bought a copy of from a bookstore in Kalispell out of curiosity, reading it cover to cover one evening at our kitchen table with an expression Dale and I could not quite interpret. The Yacht Valley account took up 4 pages, built almost entirely from Otis Pruitt's tracks, our own smokehouse story, and the general sense among Valley residents that something large and intelligent moved through that timber more often than most outsiders would ever believe. There was no mention of a cabin, a berth, or a family raised on our own hearth floor. My mother closed the book that night, set it on the shelf beside her Bible and her old nursing manuals, and told my father that whatever else came of that whole strange summer, at least the one thing that mattered most had stayed exactly where it belonged, out of anyone's hands but their own. I looked Gary Pelletier up myself many years later, curious what had become of him, and found a brief newspaper notice from a small paper in eastern Washington reporting his death in 2009 at the age of 63, survived by a wife and 2 adult children. The notice mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had spent his career working as a surveyor for a county road department, a steady, unglamorous profession entirely unconnected to the subject that had once sent him crisscrossing the Pacific Northwest with a reel-to-reel recorder and a trunk full of plaster. I have thought about that detail more than once since, a man who spent one memorable summer chasing an idea he genuinely believed in, only to spend the rest of his working life measuring county easements, and I have wondered whether he ever regretted the trade or whether the single summer he spent in places like our valley was enough to sustain him through 4 decades of ordinary work afterward. My mother, when I mentioned the notice to her, said only that she hoped he had found whatever peace he was looking for, because a man who chases the impossible for a living, even briefly, deserves better than to be remembered as a curiosity himself. My father took a different lesson from those months than my mother did, and it became important later. He started paying closer attention to the timber sale maps that came through the Stoltz Company office, the parcels marked out for cutting contracts over the following 2 seasons. He never said much about why. He would just sit at our kitchen table in the evenings with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, tracing the section lines on those maps with one calloused finger, checking them against the drainage where he knew, better than any forester in Columbia Falls, that a mother and father and newborn daughter had walked back into the timber that April morning. He kept a small notebook that summer and fall, the kind he normally used for tallying board footage and crew hours, and instead filled its pages with observations that had nothing to do with any contract he'd yet been assigned. Slope percentages estimated by eye and later checked against a hand level. Notes on where the snowpack held longest in the spring, which told him plenty about how saturated the ground stayed once it finally let go. Dates and rough locations for every set of tracks he came across on his own hunting and scouting trips, cross-referenced against creek drainages the way another man might track deer movement ahead of hunting season. My mother found that notebook once tucked behind the flour tin where he thought she'd never look, and she told me she understood then that her husband had taken her question from that first kitchen table conversation more seriously than either of them had let on, turning it over in his mind the same patient way he turned over any problem the woods threw at him, waiting for the day the paperwork might actually call his bluff. He was not a man given to sentiment about it, and he never once described what he was doing in those terms out loud, not even to my mother. But she told me she came to see that notebook as its own kind of quiet promise, made the same way most promises worth keeping get made in a household like ours, without ceremony, without announcement, simply through the steady accumulation of small, careful actions that added up over enough months to something that looked a great deal like devotion. What happened next is the part of this story my mother had to carry the longest, because by the following winter, the thing standing between the survival of a family she had come to care for and the survival of her own family's income for the year had become the most real decision of her life. That summer passed quietly, in most respects the same as any other summer on our homestead. We put up hay for the 2 milk cows and the horses on a small hand-cut field my father maintained below the cabin, working from first light until the heat pushed us indoors most afternoons, and my mother spent June and July canning everything the garden and the surrounding timber offered: huckleberries and thimbleberries picked by the coffee can full, stream beans and beets from rows. Dale and I were responsible for weeding whether we wanted to be or not. Evenings, when the chores were finished, my father sometimes took Dale and me down to a bend in the Yak River, where the current slowed enough to hold cutthroat trout, and we fished with cane poles and worms dug from the compost pile while my mother sat on the bank with her mending, the whole scene so ordinary that it was easy, on the best of those evenings, to half forget that anything strange had happened at all that spring. We saw signs of the family through July and August, much as you might notice a neighbor's dog cutting across your back pasture, tracks along the same game trail, the occasional grouse or trout left on the chopping block after a night when we'd heard calls up on the ridge. My father built a second smokehouse that August, 20 yards further from the tree line than the first one had stood, and he never said outright why. But my mother told me once that she thought he did it less to protect our meat from them and more to give them a wider berth out of simple respect. By September, my father had been offered something he had wanted for 3 years running. Stoltz Land and Lumber was putting together a 2-season cutting contract on a block of timber up the Vinyl Creek drainage a few miles northwest of our place, and the company foreman, a man named Ralph Dunbar, who had known my father since they'd both started as choker setters in the same crew back in the 60s, came to our cabin himself to offer him the lead position. Ralph sat at our kitchen table for the better part of an hour that afternoon, laying out the terms the way an old friend does rather than the way a company man does, though the two were not always easy to tell apart in Ralph's case. He told my father the contract would run through 2 full winters, steady work, instead of the piecemeal seasonal jobs my father had scraped together for most of a decade, with a lead foreman's wage that was better than anything Stoltz had offered him before. He unrolled the section map right there on our kitchen table, weighting the corners down with the sugar bowl and a coffee cup, and traced the cutting boundary with his finger, while my mother stood at the stove with her back to both of them, listening to every word without turning around once. My father asked the questions any careful foreman would ask about access roads, about crew size, about the timeline for getting equipment up that grade before the fall rains made the spur roads impassable. He did not ask a single question that afternoon about the lower third of the unit, the stretch running closest to the creek itself, though my mother told me later she had watched his eyes settle there on the map more than once while Ralph talked, lingering just a beat too long for a man who was only thinking about board footage. Ralph left in good spirits, certain he had his foreman for the next 2 winters, and it was not until after his truck had rattled back down our spur road that my father finally sat back down at the table, alone this time, and unrolled the map again to look at it properly. It meant steady work through 2 full winters instead of the piecemeal seasonal contracts my father usually scraped together. It meant enough money to finally put a proper roof on the cabin instead of patching the old shakes every spring, and enough left over to send Dale into town for decent boots instead of the hand-me-downs he'd been wearing 2 sizes too small since Christmas. It also meant when my father sat at our kitchen table that night and unrolled the section map Ralph had left with him, that the cutting boundary for the first season ran directly up the Vinyl Creek drainage, through the exact stand of old cedar and hemlock where we had watched a mother and father and their newborn daughter walk back into the timber the previous April. My father did not say anything about it to my mother that first night. He sat at the table long after Dale and I had been sent up to the loft, the lamp burning low, tracing the section lines with his finger, the way he had taken to doing all that autumn, and I heard my mother come and sit across from him sometime after midnight and ask him, plainly, whether he had made up his mind. I was not supposed to be listening. I was 10 years old and curious in the particular way children get curious about the things adults try hardest to keep quiet, and I lay very still at the top of the ladder with my ear near the gap in the floorboards, and I heard nearly everything that was said in our kitchen that night. I noticed the strain in the house all that autumn before I ever understood its source. My mother grew quieter at the stove, humming less, and my father took to walking the property alone in the evenings after supper instead of sitting by the fire mending harness the way he usually did through the cooling months. Dale noticed it too, though neither of us said much to each other about it. Both of us old enough by then to understand that some kinds of worry in a household are better left unspoken until the adults themselves choose to speak of them. I remember lying awake more than one night that October, listening to the low murmur of my parents' voices through the curtain that separated their sleeping area from the rest of the cabin, unable to make out words, only the rhythm of 2 people working through a decision neither of them wanted to face alone. My father told her the money was more than he had ever been offered for a single contract in his life. He told her that a man could not raise two children on principle alone, that the roof over our heads leaked in three places, that Dale needed boots and I needed a proper winter coat instead of one of his old work jackets cut down to fit, and that somewhere up that same drainage, whether he took the contract or not, another crew would eventually be sent in to cut it, because Stoltz owned the rights, and the timber was going to come down with him leading the crew or without him. My mother did not raise her voice. She never did, not in all the years I knew her. She told him that she understood every word of what he'd said and that none of it was wrong, and then she asked him a question that I have carried with me for almost 50 years. She asked him what kind of man he wanted Dale and me to grow up believing he was, not the man who put a new roof over our heads, the man who, given the choice between a good winter and the family that had trusted us with the most vulnerable night of their lives, chose the roof. My father did not answer her that night. He rolled the map back up, set it on the shelf by the door, and went to bed without another word, and my mother sat alone at the table for a long while after, the lamp burning down low before she finally banked the fire and followed him. They spoke of it again 2 nights later, and this time I stayed awake for the whole of it. My father told her he had run the numbers 3 different ways, and none of them left much room for turning the contract down outright. He was not a wealthy man, and he had never pretended to be one, and he told her plainly that principle did not keep a roof from leaking or put boots on a growing boy's feet. My mother did not dispute a single figure he laid out. She told him instead about a mother she had once nursed through a stillbirth back in her hospital years in Kalispell, a young woman whose husband had wanted to leave the room rather than watch, and how she had told that man, in no uncertain terms, that a person does not get to choose only the easy parts of standing beside someone in their worst hour. She told my father that opening our door in March had been the easy part, the part that asked nothing of him but a moment's courage. What she was asking of him now was the harder part, the part that asked for patience and cleverness and a willingness to give up something real in exchange for nothing he would ever be able to point to or prove. My father sat with that for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table the way he did when he was working something out. Then he said, in the voice I remembered him using for very few things in his life, that he supposed there was more than one way to keep a promise, and that a man who could read slope grade and soil saturation as well as he could ought to be able to find the honest kind. Over the following 2 weeks, my father did something I did not fully understand until I was old enough to work in the woods myself. He did not refuse the contract outright, and he did not tell Ralph Dunbar or anyone else at Stoltz anything about what our family had witnessed the previous March, because saying it out loud to men who would only see dollar value and novelty in it was never something either of my parents considered. Instead, my father spent 3 full days walking the Vinyl Creek drainage on his own time, acting as though he were only scouting the cutting unit ahead of the contract the way any responsible foreman would, and he came back each evening with detailed notes on slope grades, soil saturation, and the proximity of the cut boundary to the creek's high water mark. What my father found, and what he genuinely believed to be true, regardless of any other motive he carried into that timber, was that the lower third of the proposed unit sat on ground steep enough and wet enough that a clear cut through it would almost certainly trigger slope failure into the creek the following spring, the kind of erosion event that had already happened twice elsewhere in the Kootenai National Forest that decade and drawn unwelcome attention from the regional office in Missoula. Under the environmental review requirements that had come into force earlier that decade, any timber sale on national forest land had to account for exactly that kind of watershed risk before cutting could proceed, and my father, who had spent 20 years reading terrain the way other men read a newspaper, knew precisely how to write up a slope stability concern that no district ranger could responsibly wade through. He brought his notes to the district ranger station in Troy himself in person rather than routing them through Ralph Dunbar and the company office the way the paperwork was supposed to flow. And he sat across the desk from a young ranger named Wendell Corbin and laid out in plain and accurate terms exactly why he believed the lower portion of the Vinyl Creek unit should be pulled from the cutting boundary before the contract went forward. Wendell was maybe 30 years old at the time, 2 years into his post at the Troy District Office after finishing a forestry degree at the University of Montana, and my father told me once that the young ranger had listened to the whole presentation with the careful, slightly skeptical patience of a man used to loggers overstating hazards to avoid the harder cutting units. He asked my father pointed questions about soil composition, about the grade percentage on the lower slope, about how close the timber actually stood to the ordinary high water mark of the creek itself. My father answered every one of them from memory because he had walked that ground 3 separate days with exactly these questions in mind, pacing off distances, digging his boot heel into wet ground to test how far down the saturation ran, marking the steepest pitches with a hand level he'd borrowed from a surveyor friend in town. Wendell told him he would need to see it himself before recommending any change to the sale boundary, and my father offered to walk it with him the following week, an October morning that came in cold and clear after 3 straight days of rain, the kind of high-pressure break that turns the whole Kootenai country gold and silver at once, larch needles going bright yellow against the dark green of the cedar and hemlock, the creek running high and fast with runoff. Wendell arrived at our cabin before 7 with a soil auger and a clipboard, and my mother sent them both off with coffee in a thermos and a warning to be back before dark, spoken in a tone that told my father and told me too, listening from the loft, that she understood exactly what ground he was about to walk and exactly what was at stake and how convincing he managed to be. The two of them spent the better part of that cold October day walking the same drainage where my father knew, with a certainty he could never have explained to Wendell, that a family was watching them from somewhere back in the timber the entire time. He did not mention a mother, a father, or a newborn daughter. He did not need to. Every word he said about the ground itself was true on its own terms, and it was enough. What it cost my father to protect something the rest of the world did not know existed when the protecting had to look on paper like nothing more than an ordinary act of caution turned out to be less than he feared and more than he expected in almost equal measure. Wendell Corbin reviewed my father's notes over the following week, walked the drainage himself with a soil scientist from the Libby District Office, and confirmed enough of what my father had flagged that the lower third of the Vinyl Creek unit was pulled from the sale boundary entirely, redrawn to leave a buffer running nearly a quarter-mile back from the creek on both sides. It was not an unusual outcome. Slope failures on cut ground had cost the Forest Service enough embarrassment and enough genuine watershed damage over the previous several years that a foreman flagging a legitimate erosion risk was exactly the kind of caution the regional office wanted to see more of, not less. Ralph Dunbar drove back up our spur road himself the day the revised contract came through, and this time he did not sit long at our kitchen table. My mother told me she watched the whole exchange from the stove, my father standing on the porch with the amended map in one hand while Ralph flipped through it with visible irritation, tallying the lost board footage out loud, muttering about a young ranger who had never so much as run a chainsaw, questioning the judgment of men who'd been reading that ground since before he was born. My father let him talk himself out. He did not defend the report or argue the numbers because there was nothing in the report to argue, every figure in it accurate and independently confirmed by a licensed soil scientist. Ralph finally folded the map back up, told my father the reduced unit still needed a foreman, and he supposed my father might as well keep the job, since nobody else on the crew had bothered to walk the ground half as thoroughly, and drove back down the mountain grumbling the whole way. My father told my mother that night, once the children were sent up to the loft and the two of them sat alone at the table, that watching Ralph complain about lost timber had been the strangest kind of relief he had ever felt, because every word of frustration out of Ralph's mouth was proof the boundary really had moved, that the paperwork had actually held, and that somewhere up that drainage a family was going to spend another winter undisturbed because of nothing more than an honest measurement of slope and saturation. My mother reached across the table and took his hand, and neither of them said anything else about it that night because there was nothing left that needed saying. Ralph Dunbar grumbled about the lost board footage when the revised contract came back smaller than expected, but he signed off on it, and my father kept the lead position on the reduced unit, cutting timber through that winter and the next on ground, well clear of the drainage where the family we'd met had gone back into the trees. the money was less than the full contract would have paid. We did not get the new roof that winter. We got it 2 winters later instead, and Dale wore his boots 2 sizes too small through most of that November before my mother finally traded 4 of her canning jars full of huckleberry preserves to a woman in town for a used pair closer to his size. I do not remember any of us feeling shortchanged by it. I remember my mother humming while she worked that whole winter in a manner I had not heard from her in a long time, and I understand now, as an adult, that the sound of it was relief. That winter, our second since the birth, was hard by any ordinary measure, one of the coldest the Yak had seen in years, with snowpack up past the porch rail by January and temperatures that dropped below zero for the better part of 3 straight weeks. My father worked his reduced timber unit through most of it, coming home each evening frosted white to the eyebrows, and my mother kept the wood stove running around the clock, rationing our supply of split fuel with the same careful discipline she brought to everything else in that household. We lost one of our 2 milk cows that January to the cold despite every precaution my father took, and I remember him standing over the animal in the barn at first light, more grieved by the loss than I had ever seen him over anything that did not involve his own family directly, because a homestead in that country ran on thin enough margins that every animal mattered in ways town people rarely had cause to understand. Even in the hardest stretch of that winter, evidence came that the family we'd helped had not forgotten us. In February, during a cold snap that kept my father indoors for 3 straight days, Dale found a cache of dried meat and a bundle of some kind of dense, chewy root vegetable neither of my parents could identify left just inside the tree line behind the barn, wrapped carefully in bark and leather in a manner that suggested real effort had gone into keeping it dry through weather that would have ruined most food left exposed. My mother cried when Dale brought it inside quietly and without explanation, and it was some time before she told him why. She said it was the first proof she'd had all winter that the sacrifice my father had made that autumn, giving up half a contract's worth of wages to protect ground that wasn't strictly his to protect, had actually mattered to the people it was meant to help rather than passing unnoticed, as so many quiet kindnesses do. We saw the family 3 times more over the following 2 years, close enough that Dale and I were left to argue for weeks afterward about exactly what we seen, though my parents never doubted any of it. The first of those 3 came in October of that same year, 7 months after the birth, and it was mine alone to witness. I had walked out to the woodlot at dusk to gather kindling my father had split that afternoon, a chore I'd done 100 times without incident, when I noticed a smaller shape at the tree line watching me with a stillness I recognized instantly from that long night in March. She could not have been more than 7 months old by any human measure, yet she already stood taller than I did, dark hair thick across her shoulders, and she watched me fill my kindling sling with the same unhurried, studious attention I remembered from her first days on our hearth floor. I did not run. I stood very still instead, the kindling sling half full in my hands, and after a long minute she took 2 slow steps out of the tree line, close enough that I could hear her breathing before crouching down and setting a small round object on a flat stone at the edge of the woodpile. Then she withdrew back into the timber as unhurried as she'd come. I carried the kindling inside and told my mother what had happened before I ever went back out to see what had been left. It was an apple, one of the small, hard crab apples that grew wild along a fence row half a mile from our place, the kind no one in our family had ever bothered picking because they were too sour to eat plain. My mother turned it over in her hands for a long moment and told me she believed it was not a gift so much as an introduction, one young creature to another, a gesture offered by a daughter old enough now to begin understanding, in whatever way her kind understood such things, that the small, quick-moving girl who sometimes appeared at the edge of her family's territory had once fed her mother a cup of broth 1 spoonful at a time during the hardest week of both their lives. The second sighting came a year later in the fall of 1979, when my father came across the whole group, mother, father, and a daughter who had grown at a rate no human child could match, crossing a logging spur nearly 2 miles from our cabin, well, within the buffer he had fought to protect. He said the male stopped and looked at him for a long moment before moving the family on into cover, No threat in the posture, nothing but a kind of acknowledgement passing between two fathers who had each in their own way done what needed doing to keep their families whole. The third came in the summer of 1981, and it was Dale who saw it alone while checking a fence line at the edge of our upper pasture. He came back to the cabin pale and quiet and told my mother that the daughter, not yet 3 years old by our count, but already standing taller than he was at 13, had been watching him from the tree line for what he guessed was several minutes before he ever noticed her, and that when their eyes finally met, she had made no move to hide or flee. She had simply watched him a moment longer, then turned and walked unhurried back into the timber, moving through ground she plainly considered safely her own. Dale described her afterward in more detail than either of my parents ever managed to pull out of him at the time, the dark, near-black hair already thick across her shoulders and forearms, the same amber cast to her eyes that we'd first seen in her mother by lamplight 3 years earlier, and a stillness in the way she held herself that he said made him feel briefly like the trespasser on that fence line rather than her. He did not tell anyone outside our family for the rest of his life. He told me once, not long before he passed, that he had thought about that moment more times over the decades than almost any other single memory from his childhood, not because it had frightened him, but because it was the first time he understood that the family my mother had helped bring into the world that March was not simply surviving out there. It was thriving, patient, and unhurried, and entirely at home in country that most people would have called empty. I want you to sit with a question for a moment before I go on, because it is one I have turned over in my own mind more times than I can count. What would it actually take for you to keep a secret of this size, not for a single frightening night, but for decade after ordinary decade, telling no one outside your own family, expecting no recognition, and knowing the whole time that the world would either refuse to believe you or descend on the very people you were protecting the moment you told the truth? The years between Dale's sighting at the fence line and my own wedding were quieter than the events of 1978 and 79, but they were not empty. I graduated from the high school in Troy in 1986, one of 11 students in my class, and spent 2 more years working at the mercantile in town before deciding, unlike most of my classmates who left the valley the first chance they got, that I had no interest in living anywhere else. My mother never asked me to stay. She never once suggested that the secret we carried was a reason to keep the family close, and I have wondered since whether that restraint cost her more than she ever let on, because I know now, raising my own children, how badly a parent wants to keep the people who understand the deepest parts of them within easy reach. I enrolled in a licensed practical nursing program in Kalispell in 1988, the same city where my mother had trained decades earlier, and I have often thought there was little accident in that choice, however much I told myself at the time that I was simply following the most practical path available to a girl who wanted steady work close to home. I finished the program in 1990 and spent the next 31 years working at the small clinic in Troy, delivering babies of my own when the circumstances called for it, setting broken bones, and sitting with dying patients through their final hours, the same unglamorous, essential work my mother had done before me in the same corner of Montana, carrying forward a family tradition of steadiness under pressure that I did not fully appreciate until I was much older. I retired from the clinic in 2021, and I have spent the years since splitting my time between my own small piece of ground and the old homestead property, which passed to me after my mother's death and which Curtis and I have kept up rather than sold, despite offers from more than one out-of-state buyer drawn by the same wild, isolated beauty that once made the Yak feel like the edge of the known world to a young nurse and a logger building a life together in 1968. The Yak has changed since then, much as most remote places eventually change. A handful of newer cabins scattered along roads that used to dead end at nothing. A growing trickle of visitors drawn less by timber work now than by the same isolation that once kept outsiders away entirely. The mercantile in Yacht proper still stands, still sells about the same mixture of hardware and groceries it always has, and the old crowd that used to gather at the tavern in Troy has thinned considerably as the men my father worked alongside have passed on one by one, replaced by a younger generation that knows the valley's timber history, mostly through stories rather than direct memory. I am, more often than not these days, one of the oldest people in any room I sit in around here, a fact that would have startled the 10-year-old girl who once stood frozen in a cabin corner holding a lamp with shaking hands, and which reminds me, more than almost anything else, how much time has actually passed since that storm first brought a frightened mother to our door. I had my own encounter that decade in the late summer of 1985, the kind I never told anyone outside the family until I was well into my 30s. I was 17, walking back from the Mercantile along the river trail instead of taking the road, a shortcut I'd used 100 times without incident, when I came around a bend and found the trail blocked, not by a fallen tree or a washout, but by a broad, unmoving shape standing motionless in the middle of the path, perhaps 40 yards ahead, backlit by the late afternoon sun coming through the cedar canopy in a way that turned the whole scene the color of old brass. I did not run. I want to be honest about that because running is what any reasonable person would expect of a girl alone on a forest trail confronted with something that large, and it is not what happened. I stood very still instead, much as my mother had once described standing still on her own porch years earlier, and I said out loud into the quiet that I was Loretta Praether's daughter and that I meant no harm to anyone. I do not know whether the words themselves carried any meaning across that distance, but the shape held its position a moment longer, dipped what I understood even then to be its head once. In the same deliberate gesture I remembered the male making toward my mother across our own clearing 7 years earlier, and then it stepped off the trail into the timber and was gone before I had drawn my next full breath. I stood there a long while afterward, my heart going hard in my chest, despite every calm word I had just spoken, and then I walked the remaining distance home and told my mother exactly what had happened, word for word, while she sat at the kitchen table with her mending in her lap and listened without once interrupting me. She told me when I finished that she was not surprised. She said that whatever bond had formed on our cabin floor in March of 1978 had never belonged only to her, that it had settled itself over our whole family the moment the family we'd helped chose to trust us at all, and that it did not seem strange to her in the least that one of its members might recognize a Praether on a forest trail 7 years later and choose, on purpose, to let itself be seen rather than vanish as it clearly could have. She never treated that encounter as anything but confirmation of a truth she had already accepted long before I ever brought it home to her. I married a man named Curtis Halverson in 1990, a fellow I met at a Grange dance in Troy, born and raised on a cattle ranch outside Eureka, who had never spent a night of his life anywhere but Lincoln County. I told him the full truth 2 weeks before our wedding, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where my mother had once asked my father what kind of man he wanted his children to believe he was, because I could not, in good conscience, marry a man and bring him onto ground that carried an obligation of that size without giving him the chance to walk away from it first. Curtis listened to the whole account without interrupting, much as a patient rancher listens to a complicated diagnosis on a sick animal, weighing each piece of information before reacting to any of it. When I finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me a single question, whether the family was still out there and still safe. I told him, as far as I knew, yes. He nodded, took my hand across the table, and said that any woman raised by a mother steady enough to deliver that particular birth without losing her nerve was exactly the kind of woman he intended to spend his life with, and that whatever obligation came bundled with that inheritance, he was glad to carry it alongside me rather than ask me to set it down. He proved as good as his word for the following 36 years. When Wendell Corbin's roadless area proposal came up for public comment in 1994, it was Curtis, not me, who drove down to the meeting in Troy and spoke in favor of the expanded boundary, framing his support in terms of watershed protection and elk habitat rather than anything closer to the truth, because he understood, the same way my father had understood 15 years earlier, exactly how to protect a threatened piece of ground by talking convincingly about a modest, reasonable one instead. That meeting was not an easy one to sit through. The Yak had depended on timber income for the better part of a century by then, and a good number of the men in that room, Several of them, friends and neighbors we'd known our whole lives, stood up one after another to argue that further restrictions on cutting would finish off a way of making a living that logging companies and federal policy had already been quietly strangling for years. I understood their argument. My own father had spent his life in that industry, and I had watched more than one family in the valley pack up and leave for Kalispell or Spokane over the decades as timber jobs dried up and were never replaced by anything steady enough to support a household. It would have been easy sitting in that meeting to feel that Curtis and I were arguing against our own neighbors' livelihoods for a reason we could never explain to a single one of them. Curtis handled it the only way either of us knew how, by speaking honestly about the parts of the truth that were genuinely true. The erosion risk documented decades earlier, the value of an intact watershed to the fishery downstream, the elk winter range that the drainage provided, all of it real and defensible on its own terms, even without the deeper reason underneath it. He did not win over every skeptic in that room, and the vote that followed months later passed by a narrow enough margin that Wendell Corbin told Curtis afterward it could easily have gone the other way, with a handful fewer supporters. But it did pass, and the buffer held, and I have never once in all the years since been able to fully separate my gratitude for that outcome from a quieter, more complicated grief for the working families in our own valley who lost a portion of their livelihood to a protection they were never permitted to understand the full reason for. We raised our own two children on a small piece of ground not 4 miles from my parents' cabin, close enough that my mother helped deliver both of them in the same unhurried, competent manner she had delivered half the babies in that end of the valley over the years, human and otherwise. I told my own children about that night when they were old enough to be trusted with it, just as my mother had trusted Dale and me, and I watched my daughter's face go through the same slow transformation mine must have gone through decades earlier, from disbelief to wonder to a kind of quiet, settled acceptance that this was simply a true thing about the world she happened to have been born into. My father passed away in the winter of 2003 of a heart attack while splitting wood behind the same cabin he had lived in for nearly 50 years. He was 71 years old, still cutting his own firewood, well past the age when most men in the valley had long since hired the work out because he told anyone who asked that a man who couldn't split his own kindling had no business calling himself retired. Dale found him that afternoon, still holding the splitting maul, and told me later that the first thing he did, after checking for a pulse and finding none, was walk to the tree line and stand there a long moment in the cold, as if some part of him believed the family my father had spent an entire autumn protecting might somehow sense the loss and answer it. Though nothing came, no call rolled down off the ridge that day, only the ordinary hush of a Montana winter settling over ground that had already given up all the answers it was ever going to give. We buried him in the small cemetery outside Troy on a ridge overlooking the Kootenai River, and my mother stood at the gravesite in a wool coat she'd owned longer than I had been alive, dry-eyed through the whole service in a manner that worried the neighbors more than tears would have, though I understood it for what it was. She had spent her entire married life being the steady one, the person other people leaned on in their worst hour, and burying the man she had loved for 46 years was simply one more hour she intended to stand through without asking anyone else to carry the weight of it for her. The turnout at that funeral surprised even Dale and me. Close to 100 people crowded into a church built to seat maybe 60 loggers and ranchers and shopkeepers from 3 different towns who had known my father across 4 decades of contract work, church suppers, and small favors traded back and forth, much as rural communities keep themselves running. Ralph Dunbar came, well into his 80s by then and moving slow behind a walker, and he sought my mother out afterward at the small reception in the church basement to tell her in front of anyone close enough to hear that Frank Praether had been the most honest foreman he'd ever put on a crew, a compliment that carried a private weight neither Ralph nor most of the room could have understood, given everything that honesty had actually protected. Wendell Corbin sent a card, having retired to Spokane by then and unable to make the drive, a short handwritten note that simply said he had never forgotten the October morning he'd spent walking a drainage with a man who cared more about doing a job right than about what it cost him. a sentence my mother read 3 times over before setting the card carefully inside her Bible, where I found it years later among her own effects, still tucked between the same pages where she'd once kept Gary Pelletier's paperback. She lived 7 more years in that cabin alone, refusing every offer Dale and I made to bring her into town or into either of our own homes, telling us both with the same flat certainty she'd used on my father the night she asked him what kind of man he wanted his children to believe he was, that she had made a promise to a piece of ground a long time ago and did not intend to break it just because her husband was gone and her knees had gotten bad. I drove out to check on her twice a week for those 7 years, and more often than not, I found her exactly as I always had, canning something on the stove, mending a shirt in her lap, the radio tuned low to a station out of Kalispell that had long since stopped playing the Bee Gees. Those visits became, in their own quiet manner, some of the most valuable hours of my adult life, though I did not fully appreciate them until after she was gone. My mother used the drive of an afternoon to tell me things she had never gotten around to telling me as a child. Small details from her Kalispell nursing years, stories about my father's courtship that he himself had always been too reticent to share, and more than once, fresh recollections from that March night that surfaced only in her old age, tiny fragments of memory that had apparently been waiting decades for the right moment to resurface. She told me once during one of those late visits that she could still recall the exact weight of the newborn in her arms before she passed her over to the mother. A weight she said she had never forgotten, across 4 decades and thousands of other deliveries, because it had been, in her words, the single heaviest and lightest thing she had ever held in the same instant, heavy with the size and strength already coiled inside that small body, light with the trust being placed in her 2 hands by a mother who had nowhere else in the world to turn. She passed in her sleep in the winter of 2010 in the same bed where she had delivered 3 of her own grandchildren over the years, in addition to the one impossible birth that had shaped the rest of her life. I was with her in her final weeks, staying at the cabin most nights so she would not be alone, and she talked more than she ever had before about that night in March of 1978, about the sound at the door, about the decision to lift the bar off its brackets rather than leave it down. She told me she had never once in over 30 years since regretted opening that door, and that if anything, it was the single choice in her whole life she was proudest of. Prouder than any of the human deliveries she'd attended in her nursing years, prouder than raising Dale and me, because it had cost her nothing but fear in the moment and had asked nothing more of her afterward than the willingness to keep a secret and to raise her children believing that kindness toward what looked entirely different from yourself was never, under any circumstance, a mistake. In her last conscious days, she asked me once whether I thought the daughter she had delivered that night was still out there, and I told her yes, because by then I believed it myself with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with the low calls I still heard on quiet spring nights from my own porch. My mother smiled at that, the first real smile I had seen from her in weeks, and told me that was the only kind of ending she had ever wanted for that particular story. Not a resolution, not an explanation, just the simple ongoing fact of a family still moving through the same timbers, still alive, still safe, still exactly where it belonged. The old cabin itself stood empty for close to a decade after my mother's death, before the weight of Montana winters finally collapsed the roof line sometime around 2018, a fact I did not witness firsthand but learned from Curtis, who drove up to check on the property after a particularly heavy snow year and found the whole structure sagging inward on itself. The same stone hearth where a Sasquatch had once labored through the hardest hours of her life, still standing upright among the fallen timbers, blackened with 80 years of wood smoke and stubborn enough, it seemed, to outlast the rest of the building around it. We talked about restoring it briefly before deciding that some structures are better left to settle back into the ground they came from rather than propped up past their natural span. The hearthstones remain there still, visible if you know where to look through the second growth that has already begun reclaiming the clearing, the last physical trace of the room where all of this began. I still live in the Yaak Valley, not far from where our old cabin stood before. It finally gave out to weather and time in the early 2000s. I am 58 years old now, and I have spent most of my adult life in this same corner of Montana, close enough to that timber that I still hear, on certain still nights in early spring, a low call rolling down off the ridge that no elk or owl or wind through a hollow snag has ever quite managed to explain away. I do not go looking for it. I learned that much from my mother, who never once in 30 years tried to seek out the family she had helped that night. She let them come to her on their own terms in their own time, and she considered that restraint the deepest form of the respect she owed them. What it actually costs in a single ordinary year to keep a promise nobody made them swear to and nobody would ever have held them to if they'd broken it was never written down anywhere between my parents. They never spoke it aloud to each other in so many words. It lived in the space between a leaking roof and a pair of boots 2 sizes too small. And they kept it anyway, year after year, long after the fear of that first night had faded into something closer to habit. Dale went on to run his own outfitting business out of Troy for close to 30 years, packing hunters and fishermen back into the Purcells and the Cabinet Mountains on horseback. And he told me once, not long before he passed in 2019, that he had led more than a few clients within a mile or two of the old Vinyl Creek buffer over the years, and had always found some reason to steer the pack string a different direction before they got close enough to matter. He never explained why to any of them. He just knew the ground, much as our father had taught him to know it. And some habits, once a family builds them deep enough, simply become the shape of how a person moves through the world. Dale married late at nearly 40, a woman named Carol who worked as a school teacher in Troy, and the two of them never had children of their own, which Dale told me once was the one genuine sorrow of his life, though he never spoke about it as bitterly as the words suggest. He poured that unspent devotion into his outfitting clients instead, into the horses he trained himself from green colts into steady mountain stock and into a standing invitation to any of his nieces and nephews, mine included, to spend a summer working his pack strings and learning the same country he had grown up learning. He was 74 when he died, of the same kind of heart trouble that had taken our father. And he went the same way too, more or less, out on his own ground, though in Dale's case it was a horse trail above Bull Lake rather than a woodpile behind the cabin. His clients that week, a father and two grown sons from Ohio who had booked a 5-day pack trip for elk season, told me afterward that Dale had led them the entire route without a single sign of trouble, had cooked their supper the night before over an open fire the way he'd done it for 30 years, and had simply not woken up the next morning, passing some time in the deep quiet of a mountain night in a bedroll not 200 yards from ground. He had spent his whole adult life quietly keeping clear of strangers. I drove up with Curtis to help bring him down, and standing at that camp in the gray early light, looking at the same Cabinet Mountain timber my brother had loved more than almost anything else in his life, I understood that Dale had gotten in the end close enough to the ending he would have chosen for himself if anyone had ever thought to ask him. He died in the mountains. He had spent 74 years learning to read, doing the one thing he had always been better at than almost anyone else in the valley, and I have never once, in the years since, been able to grieve that particular death without also feeling a measure of gratitude for how cleanly it happened. The Vinyl Creek drainage is still standing timber to this day, protected first by an erosion report my father wrote with only half the truth on the page, and later by wilderness study designations that came through in the decades after, closing much of that country to further cutting altogether. I like to think my father knew even in 1978 that the caution he documented that autumn would end up outlasting him, outlasting the contract, outlasting the company itself, which folded its Montana operations decades ago. I like to think some part of him understood that he was not just protecting one family for one winter, but setting aside a piece of ground that would stay wild and quiet for as long as the paperwork held, which, as it turned out, was a very long time indeed. Wendell Corbin stayed with the Forest Service for the whole of his career, eventually becoming district ranger for the Troy office himself in the late 1990s, a post he held until his own retirement in the early 2000s. I ran into him twice over the years, once at a public meeting in Troy in 1994 about a proposed roadless area review that would have folded the Vinyl Creek buffer into a much larger block of protected national forest land, and once, purely by chance, at a diner in Libby not long after my own father's funeral. At that second meeting, an old man himself by then, Wendell told me he had never forgotten walking that drainage with my father back in 1978, and that something about the thoroughness of my father's notes, the sheer excess of careful detail for what should have been a routine flag, had stayed with him his whole career as an example of what real diligence looked like in a man who had nothing obvious to gain from it. He had no idea, of course, what my father actually had to gain. I never told him. I only thanked him for the walk he'd taken that October morning and let him believe his own explanation was the whole of it. The roadless area review Wendell had championed in 1994 succeeded after years of public comment and no small amount of local controversy from timber interests who argued the valley could not survive without continued access to its own forest, enfolding several thousand additional acres around the Vinyl Creek drainage into a formally protected inventoried roadless area, a designation that has held with only minor boundary adjustments into the present day. My father did not live to see the final designation come through in 2001, but my mother did, and she told me, reading the notice in the Troy weekly paper at her own kitchen table, that it felt less like news and more like the closing of a circle her husband had started drawing decades before either of them had any idea how far it would eventually reach. There was one more close call worth mentioning, separate from Gary Pelletier and separate from anything involving the Stoltz contract, and it came in the spring of 1999, nearly 2 decades after that first storm, when a wildlife biologist with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks named Karen Voss spent an entire field season live trapping and radio collaring wolves in the drainages north of the Yaak River as part of the state's early recovery monitoring program. Wolves having begun recolonizing northwestern Montana on their own from Canadian populations through the 1980s and 90s, well ahead of any formal reintroduction effort further south. Karen's trap lines ran within 2 miles of the Vinyl Creek buffer that spring, close enough that my mother, 71 years old by then and still sharp as a fresh honed blade, took a genuine interest in making sure the young biologist's work stayed exactly where it belonged and moved no closer. My mother invited Karen to supper twice that season, on the surface out of the same neighborly hospitality she'd have shown any researcher working in the valley, and used both meals to ask careful, informed questions about wolf territory size, dispersal patterns, and how closely a collared animal's movements might be tracked once its data started coming back. What she learned and relayed to me afterward with visible relief was that the wolves denning that spring had established territory well east of the Vinyl Creek drainage, following a natural boundary along a ridge line that happened by pure geographic coincidence to keep Karen's own trap lines and monitoring routes clear of the one piece of ground my mother had spent 20 years quietly protecting. Karen did ask at that second supper whether my mother had ever noticed anything unusual moving through the timber behind our old cabin, explaining that her own trail cameras had occasionally picked up shapes she could not immediately identify, blurred and indistinct at the edge of the frame, gone again before a second exposure triggered. My mother told her with the same unhurried honesty she'd offered Gary Pelletier 2 decades earlier that plenty moved through that country. Nobody had ever properly cataloged, and left it at exactly that, an answer true enough to satisfy a working scientist's curiosity without inviting any further questions a fish and wildlife biologist might feel professionally obligated to pursue. Karen Voss's wolf research that season contributed in its own roundabout way to a broader story unfolding across Montana at the time, one my mother followed with real interest for reasons that went beyond simple neighborliness toward a young biologist she'd grown fond of. Wolves had been extirpated from most of the northern Rockies by the 1930s through decades of organized predator control, and their gradual unassisted return to northwestern Montana through the 1980s and 90s, migrating south on their own from established Canadian populations well before any formal reintroduction effort began further south in Yellowstone, represented one of the first cases in modern American history of a large predator reclaiming lost ground largely on its own initiative, protected throughout by federal endangered species listings that made killing them, outside very narrow circumstances, a serious crime. My mother told me once, not long after that second supper with Karen, that she found a quiet comfort in the wolf's return, a reminder that wild country occasionally granted its own wild things a second chance nobody had specifically planned for, provided the surrounding legal and political framework happened to align in their favor at the right moment in history. She never said so directly, but I understood, listening to her talk about it, that she was thinking as much about the family sheltering in the Vinyl Creek drainage as she was about the wolves denning 2 miles to the east, both of them dependent in their own ways on a patchwork of protections built by people who mostly had no idea what exactly they were protecting. I want to tell you about one more encounter before I close this out, because it is the one that has stayed with me longest, and because it happened close enough to my own front door that I have never doubted for even a moment that it was real. In the summer of 1996, my mother was staying with Curtis and me for a week while repairs were being done on her own cabin roof, and my daughter, 6 years old that summer, had taken to spending her evenings on our back porch watching the tree line, the same way I had once watched it as a girl, though she had grown up knowing the family's story from the time she could understand it, and carried none of the fear I'd carried at her age. On the third evening of my mother's stay, just as the light was going long and gold the way it does in the yak in July, my daughter came running into the kitchen and told us both, breathless, that there was somebody very big standing at the edge of the yard. My mother was 78 years old that summer, her hips already troubling her enough that she used a cane for anything more than a short walk across level ground, but she was up out of her chair and onto that porch faster than I had seen her move in years. What she found standing at the tree line, patient and unmoving in the low evening light, was a female Sasquatch, older now, her hair gone heavily gray through the shoulders and chest in a pattern my mother recognized instantly because it matched in shape and placement a birthmark she remembered clearly from a night 18 years earlier when that same hair had been dark as slate and soaked through with freezing rain. Neither of them moved for a long minute. Then my mother, leaning hard on her cane, walked down the porch steps and out into the yard alone the same way she had once walked out onto our old porch to show an anxious father his newborn daughter. She stopped perhaps 20 feet from the tree line and stood there, an old woman in a house dress, looking up at a mother she had helped bring a child into the world for nearly 2 decades earlier, and the two of them regarded each other in silence for what my daughter swears to this day was a full 5 minutes. Then the female made a sound, low and drawn out, different from any of the calls we had heard across those years, softer, my mother said afterward, more like a held note than a call meant to carry any distance. My mother answered the only way she knew how. She raised one hand slowly and held it there, palm open, the exact gesture she had used the night she first eased our cabin door open against the freezing rain. The female held her own hand up in response, mirroring the gesture across that 20 feet of yard, and then she turned and walked back into the timber unhurried and did not come again that week or any week after, though my mother lived another 14 years past that evening. My mother told me later that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, that she believed that encounter had been a farewell, not a desperate one, not a sorrowful one, but the kind of farewell one old mother offers another when both of them understand without needing to say it aloud, that the debt between them had been settled fully and gratefully a very long time ago, and that whatever years either of them had left were theirs now to spend exactly as they chose. She never saw that particular Sasquatch again. But she told me, more than once in her final years, that the memory of that evening, an old woman and an old mother meeting once more in a Montana backyard nearly 20 years after a storm had first brought them together, was the single image she returned to most often when she needed reminding that her life had been well spent. My mother used to say that the hardest part of that whole story was never the birth itself, strange as it was to witness, and never the fear of what might happen if word ever got out. The hardest part, she told me, was the ordinary decision that came after, made not in a single dramatic moment but slowly over weeks, at a kitchen table weighing a family's need for a decent roof against a debt she felt she owed to a mother who had trusted her with the most defenseless hour of her life. She said, "Any fool can act bravely for one frightening night. It takes something steadier to keep choosing the same kindness quietly for years when no one is watching and no one would ever know the difference if you stopped." I think about that mother sometimes, the one who came to our door in the freezing rain with nowhere else to turn, and I think about the daughter she carried into the world on our cabin floor, who would be nearly 50 years old herself by now if she is still living, moving through timber that is still standing today, in part because two ordinary people in a homestead cabin decided, on an ordinary night, that a knock at the door in the middle of a storm deserved to be answered with an open hand rather than a closed one. People sometimes ask me when I've told this story in the years since whether I ever wished my parents had done something different that night, called someone, told someone, let the world in on what we'd seen, and let the world decide what to do about it. I understand why the question gets asked. It is the natural question for anyone who did not grow up the way Dale and I grew up, watching two ordinary people carry an impossible secret with the same steady hands they use for splitting wood and mending fence. But I have never once wished it, not for a single day of my life. I think about what would have happened to that mother and her newborn daughter if word had gotten out in 1978 in a country still years away from any real understanding of what it was looking at. I think about trucks full of men with rifles and cameras working their way up every spur road in the Yak. I think about a young family torn out of the only country they had ever known and studied under lights in some university basement, and I understand more completely with every year that passes exactly what my mother meant when she said that the hardest part was never the one frightening night. The hardest part was every quiet, unremarkable day afterward, when protecting them meant doing absolutely nothing at all except letting them stay exactly what they had always been, left alone. I want to tell you what I know about the male, the father who stood at our tree line that first week and touched his newborn daughter's head with a gentleness none of us expected from a being so large. We saw far less of him across the decades than we did of the mother, which my own mother always attributed to simple biology rather than any lesser bond. Males of most large mammal species ranging farther and staying more solitary outside of breeding and rearing seasons, and whatever these beings were, they seemed to follow a similar pattern in that respect, if in few others. Dale caught sight of him twice more in his years running pack strings through the Cabinet Mountains, both times at considerable distance, both times in country well south of the Vinyl Creek drainage, which told my father when Dale reported it that the male's own range extended a good deal farther than any of us had assumed from those early sightings close to home. My father took a strange comfort in that news, reasoning that a being with country enough to roam freely across two mountain ranges was a being with genuine freedom, not a creature confined by the small buffer he'd managed to carve out around one drainage, and that the protection our family had fought for was never meant to be a fence so much as a single safe room within a much larger house that already mostly belonged to them. The last confirmed sighting of the male came to us secondhand through Dale in the autumn of 2006. One of Dale's longtime clients, a retired school teacher from Spokane, who had booked the same October elk hunt with him for 11 consecutive years, and who Dale trusted enough that he never steered this particular man's route away from anything, reported glassing a shape from a ridge above Bull Lake that matched in every detail the client could offer, the same broad-shouldered, dark-haired figure Dale himself remembered from his own encounters decades earlier. The shape had been standing motionless on a rock outcrop for the better part of 10 minutes, according to the client, simply watching the valley below before it turned and moved off unhurried into heavier timber. Dale never confirmed to that client what he suspected he'd actually witnessed. He only told me once the season ended that the shape's silvered temples and the particular set of its shoulders matched an old memory closely enough that he had no real doubt it was the same individual, older now by 28 years, still alive, still moving through the same wild country he had claimed as his own since before any of us ever knew he existed. I think about him sometimes, much as I think about my own father, an older man moving carefully through mountains he has spent a lifetime learning, still strong enough to climb, but wise enough by then to conserve that strength for what actually matters. I do not know if he is still alive today. The oldest confirmed sighting our family holds any real confidence in is now nearly 2 decades past, and whatever the natural lifespan of his kind might be, a subject on which no science exists and no science is likely to exist anytime soon, I have to accept that he may well be gone by now, passed somewhere in that timber, the same private, unwitnessed way most wild things pass, leaving behind nothing more than an absence that only the family closest to him would ever notice or grieve. My own children are grown now. My daughter, the one who watched her grandmother meet an old friend across our backyard in 1996, works as a large animal veterinarian out of Kalispell, close enough that she still drives up to the yak most months to check on the small herd of cattle Curtis and I kept until his own needs finally forced us to sell off the last of them a few years back. My son settled even closer, running the outfitting business Dale left behind when there was no direct heir of Dale's own to inherit it, packing hunters and anglers into the same Cabinet Mountain country his uncle once knew better than any man alive, and carrying, I like to think, at least a portion of the same instinct for reading ground that ran through my father and my brother both. I told both of my children everything, every detail of that March night and everything that came after, when each of them turned 16, the same age at which I judged Dale and I had finally been old enough to fully understand the weight of what we were being asked to carry. Neither of them has ever spoken of it outside our own family, and both of them in their own ways have shown me over the years that they understood exactly what my mother meant about kindness toward what looks entirely different from yourself, never once being a mistake. My son named his own daughter, born in 2011, Loretta, after the great-grandmother she never met, and I have watched that little girl grow up, spending her summers on the same ground where all of this began, walking the same game trails, listening for the same low calls on quiet spring evenings, carrying forward a family inheritance that has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the choice one frightened, capable woman made on a single stormy night nearly 50 years ago. My mother has been gone for over 15 years now, and I still catch myself on quiet spring nights, standing at my own window listening for that low call on the ridge the same way she must have listened for it for the rest of her life after that march. I have never heard it answered the way it was answered that first night, calling for a mate across a dark clearing. But I have heard it enough times over enough years to know that somewhere up that drainage, a family my mother helped bring safely into the world is still out there, still moving through the same cedar and hemlock timber, still keeping to itself the way it always did, asking nothing of us now except the one thing my mother gave freely from the very first night, to be left quietly and completely alone. I still keep my mother's old nursing bag, the same canvas satchel she carried into that clearing of firelight and freezing rain in 1978, hanging on a peg by my own back door, more out of memory than necessity now. My hands are not steady enough anymore for the work she did, and there has been no second knock in the night in all the years since, no second mother arriving out of a storm with nowhere else to turn. But I keep the bag hanging there anyway because it reminds me every single day of the choice she made before either of us understood what a strange and permanent gift a single open door could turn out to be. My granddaughter Loretta turns 15 this year, the same age I was when my own mother first sat me down and told me she believed I was old enough to fully carry what our family carried. I have not had that conversation with her yet in its complete form, though she has grown up around enough of the story's edges that I suspect she already understands more than either of her parents realize. She spends her summers exactly where I spent mine, on ground that has now sheltered 4 generations of our family, and as far as I can tell, at least 3 generations of a family that shares none of our blood and all of our history. I watch her some evenings standing at the edge of the old homestead clearing, still and patient in a manner that reminds me, more than I ever expected it to, of my own mother on the night she first stepped out onto that porch without a lamp or a rifle. And I wonder sometimes whether some inheritance is passed down through a family regardless of blood, carried instead through the simple, repeated act of choosing, generation after generation, to stand still and trust rather than run. I plan to tell her everything this coming spring on an evening I have already chosen carefully, the anniversary of that first storm, sitting at whatever kitchen table happens to be closest at hand when the moment feels right. I will tell her about the meat house and the tracks in the snow, about the sound at the door and the freezing rain, about a mother in labor who trusted a stranger's open hand over a closed one, and about a great-great-grandmother who spent one long night proving that the most ordinary kind of courage, the kind that simply lifts a bar off its brackets and steps forward, can echo through a family for 50 years and counting. I do not know exactly how she will receive it. I only know that I intend to tell it the same unhurried, honest way it was always told to me, and to trust, as every generation before me has trusted, that the story is worth carrying forward exactly as it happened, no more and no less. I am 58 years old as I tell you this, sitting on the same stretch of the Yak Valley where all of it began, and I do not know how many more years I have left to keep watching that tree line as my mother did before me. But I know that whatever years remain, I intend to spend at least some part of every one of them exactly as she taught me to, listening for a low call on a quiet evening, keeping a promise that was never written down anywhere except in the accumulated weight of every ordinary, unremarkable day since 1978, and trusting, the same way she trusted, that some kindnesses are worth keeping precisely because no one outside the family will ever know they were kept at all. If you ever find yourself walking that stretch of the Yak, up past where the pavement runs out and the Forest Service road narrows down to gravel and then to dirt, past the buffer along Vinyl Creek that still stands the way my father left it, listen for a low call rolling down off the ridge on a still spring evening. It will not answer you back. It never answered anyone but its own kind, not in 50 years, and my mother would tell you that was exactly as it should be. But it is there. I have heard it more times than I can count, in the same country where a frightened mother once stood, swaying against our woodpile in the freezing rain, waiting to see whether the hand that opened our door would be closed against her or open all the way. My mother chose open. She never once, in the rest of her long life, wished she had chosen anything else.